In 1565, the Great Siege of Malta, one of the most pivotal historical battles in all of history, certainly one of the greatest sieges in all of history. In 1565, Islam was threatening all of Europe. The Ottoman Turkish Empire had conquered the entire Middle East, all of North Africa, and what used to be the Byzantine Empire. They sacked the greatest city in the world at one time, Constantinople, which today has been renamed Istanbul. And they massacred the entire Christian population there when they took Istanbul. That would have been 1452. In 1526, the Turks had unsuccessfully besieged Vienna in the very heart of Europe. Muslim slave raiders were depopulating whole villages, attacking coastal towns of Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, England, Wales, and Ireland, even as far afield as Iceland. They were seizing white slaves. 1.1 million white Europeans were enslaved by Muslim slave raiders between 1500 and 1800. And they were kidnapped by Muslim pirates, what were called the Barbary pirates, between 1500 and 1800. Many of them ended up as rowers, like Ben-Hur style, rowing in galleys while being whipped. And they built most of the palaces and most of the forts, harbors in the whole of North Africa. People often wondered, how did Europe get involved in North Africa to stop the Muslim slave raid? So Italy took Libya to stop slave raids in Italy from Libya. France took Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco to stop slave raids in them. And Spain took some parts to prevent them coming over. So even the American Marines were launched to the shores of Tripoli to stop the slave raids coming from North Africa, from the Muslims slave raiding Europe. But one thorn in the side of the aggressive expansionism of the Ottoman Empire was the Christian island of Malta, just below the boot of Sicily, under the leg, or the football of Sicily, under the boot of Italy. So Malta had a very critical place just between the eastern and the western Mediterranean. And Malta was the headquarters of the last Crusaders, the Knights Hospitaller, or the Order of St. John of Jerusalem. They were the final knights. The last knights to leave the Holy Land were the Knights of St. John. They maintained the island of Rhodes, and they had raided Islamic shipping that set many Christian captives free from Islamic slavery on these rowboats or these galleys. And often during severe sieges of the island of Rhodes, their position in the eastern Mediterranean became indefensible. They were not given enough support, supplies from the west. They were running out of food, they were running out of supplies, ammunition, gunpowder. They didn't have enough to survive, so they just had to sail away and leave that island to the Muslims. The Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Charles V, offered the Knights of St. John the island of Malta as a new base for the operations, which was hardly generous. This is just a rock, not a river, not a fertile territory. You couldn't even grow crops there. This is just a rock in the middle of the sea. So to have given them this very inhospitable island was not exactly generous, but then Charles V is not known as a great hero of the faith. On the 26th of October, 1530, the Knights of St. John sailed into Malta's Grand Harbour, and they turned the strategic island into a naval base from which they intercepted many Muslim slave raiders, and they endangered the lucrative Muslim piracy and slavery racket. Throughout the years, the guerre de corps, or the running battle, between the Muslim slave raiding pirates and the Knights of St. John continued unabated. And as the Knights of St. John continued to interdict and harass the Turkish piracy routes, Suleiman the Magnificent, now you can be sure he named himself this, it's not his enemies, Vice-Regent of God on earth, Lord of the lords of the east and the west, possessor of men's necks, King of believers and unbelievers, mighty, majestic Caesar, etc., etc. I mean, his praise singers were busy for quite a while. There's no end of self. Like these days, people have a CV. Well, back then they had these praise singers singing this kind of nonsense. He mobilized the largest armada yet seen, even made the Spanish armada seem small. 193 ships, 40,000 fighting men, including 6,300 of the elite janissaries, who also had their own praise singers. They were called the Invincible Ones. Well, that was wishful thinking in this case, but that's what they were called. Their objective to wipe the Knights of St. John off the face of the earth, capture the strategic island of Malta for Islam. So long as Malta remains in the hands of the Knights, so long will relief from Constantinople to Tripoli run the danger of being taken or destroyed. This cursed rock is like a barrier interposed between us and your possessions. In other words, the loot that you want to steal. This isn't the first time that the Turks had attempted to seize Malta. In 1551, the corsair Turgot Rey, who is Turco the Red, he is a Christian who had been kidnapped and converted by force to Islam as a youngster. He invaded the island with a force of over 10,000 fighting men. This attempt failed, so Turgot withdrew and he bombarded the neighboring island of Gozo, sort of second prize. And after population surrendered and opened the gates of the city, the Muslims looted the town, enslaved virtually every one of the population of 5,000 people. So as a result of this failed siege of 1551, the Knights of St. John strengthened Fort St. Angelo at the tip of Burgu, as well as constructing two new forts, Fort St. Michael at Sengali and Fort St. Elmo on Mount Skidabas. Now, all three of these forts played a crucial role during the Great Siege of 1564. The Grand Master of the Order of St. John, Jean de Valette, began vigorous preparations to enable Malta to survive an extended siege. In May 1560, the Ottoman victory in the naval battle of Jerba captured or sunk about half the Spanish naval expedition which sought to evict the corsair pirates from Tripoli. And this disaster marked the high point of the Ottoman Turkish domination of the Mediterranean Sea. It was downhill from here for them. But the espionage network of Jean de Valette, the Knights of Malta master, set about accumulating stores, ammunition, strengthening the fortifications, recruiting further fighting men, and recalling all knights to Malta. Victory loves preparation. And by the way, this is what a knight in the 1500s would have worn. And you'd have to be pretty fit just to be able to wear this, let alone walk, ride, and fight in it. But this is the equipment, and you will notice all the way down to the rosary beads, these metal shoes, the sword, the halberd, dagger, there's a whole range of things, helmets. It would have taken a while just to get dressed, which explains why these knights tended to have an assistant who was absolutely essential. You couldn't put all this armor on your own, let alone mount your horse. This is the reality of Europe at this time. You can see how big Russia is. You can see how big Lithuania is. There isn't a Poland at this moment. Sorry, this is Poland. That's before Lithuania took over. Sweden, at this stage, controlled Norway. Russia didn't yet control Finland. Finland was still under Sweden. And you can see France, Spain, Portugal. Italy's not united yet. Italy's still multiple countries. Germany's not united yet. Germany's lots and lots of little countries. But Austria is quite constrained at this stage because the Turks are right up to Budapest and Vienna. And the Turks control even Greece at this stage. So that gives you a bit of a feel. From a political point of view, here's a better perspective. By the way, the Netherlands at this stage was a colony of Spain. And you can also see how the Papal States are still taking part of Italy. The situation here is quite different. Notice at this moment, Crimea and much of Ukraine is in the hands of the Turks. When people complain about Russia invading Crimea, that's just not true. The Russians liberated Crimea in the 1700s under Queen Catherine the Great from the Turks. And so Crimea has always been Russian. In fact, Crimea has been Russian for longer than Hawaii and Alaska have been American. Much longer. And people talking about Russia must return Crimea don't know what they're talking about. That's never going to happen. That's impossible. And it's very important to Russia as terms of a naval base, but also the majority of the population in Crimea are Russian. So that's what they voted for too. But you can see the Ottoman Empire at this stage covers what we today call Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, huge parts under the Ottoman Empire, and a lot of liberation to go on from there. The official historian of the Order of St. John, Giacomo Bazio, recorded that the Turkish fleet consisted of 193 vessels, including 131 galleys. Now, galleys did have sails, but they also had oars. A galley needed oars most of the time, and so that's the difference between later sailing ships and the galleys. The galleys are rowing vessels. 7 galleots, which are colossal, mega, monstrous galleys. 11 large merchant ships. One alone had 600 armed men, 6,000 barrels of gunpowder, 1,300 rounds of cannonballs. So there's a huge amount of naval wear in this flotilla. Balbi de Correggio, in his famous siege diary, which is a major source for tonight's presentation, he records the Turkish invading force included 6,300 Janissaries, they were the elite, 6,000 Spahis, or cavalry, 4,000 religious fanatics, that's their terms. I mean, what are the others? They must have been pretty extreme. 2,500 spies from Romania, 500 spies from Karamania, 6,000 other volunteers, various corsairs or pirates from Tripoli and Algeria, totaling 48,000 fighting men in all. That's a big army. On the Christian side, there were less than 700 knights. In fact, there were less than 500 at first, but I'm counting in the knights that came as reliefs and drips and drabs throughout the siege. So actually, there were, but to count the whole battle, it includes 700 knights, 400 Spanish soldiers, 800 Italian soldiers, 200 Greek and Sicilian soldiers, and approximately 3,000 soldiers in a broader sense of the term. These were more militia. They were civilians who were given weapons from the Maltese population. So that's a force of 9,000 men, but it's not 9,000 trained soldiers, because 3,000 of them have no formal training at all. But the defenders, armed men, 9,000 in all, to face 48,000. The Grand Master of the Order of St. John, Jean de Valletta, was 71 years old when the siege began. He had been a Knight of St. John since he was 18 years old, so this man had a lifetime of experience, and he is a veteran of the Siege of Rhodes of 1522. So the reason why he was able to do so well is he knew what a siege was, he had lived through a siege, and he had even been captured and survived as a year as a galley slave, rowing up to 20 hours a day in a Muslim galley. You know, battle speed, ramming speed, Ben-Hur type of stuff. Can you imagine? Valletta challenged his knights. It is a great battle of the cross versus the Quran, which is now to be fought. A formidable army of infidels are on the point of invading our island. We, for our part, are the chosen soldiers of the cross. And if heaven requires this sacrifice of our lives, there can be no better occasion than this. Let us hasten then, my brothers, to the sacred altar. There we will renew our vows and retain our faith in the blessed sacraments. We must retain that contempt for death, which alone can render us invincible. And the Knights of St. John were known to be people who scorned death. They didn't hesitate to give their lives for the cross. And so when the knights left the church, they were filled with enthusiastic joy. It was reported after the service, every kind of weakness disappeared. All divisions between them, all private animosity ceased. There's nothing like facing imminent death to sort out people's priorities. It's not worth holding on to that grudge, not worth staying divided. And so people embraced, resolved problems because they were going to fight for their lives, literally. The Knights of the Order of St. John were devout, they were aristocratic, they were warlike. They boasted the bluest of blood amongst their members. They had spent their entire life training for war. Their whole life was warfare, training, riding, fencing, sword fighting, archery. I mean, that's all they lived for. They were military monks. They were dedicated, like ordained, consecrated to war for the cross. And they'd developed an efficient security service to provide armed escorts for Christian pilgrims who were traveling through to the Holy Land, which was a very dangerous route going through Muslim jihadist territories. Now, after the success of the First Crusade, the Knights of St. John became the first military order in 1113. And young aristocrats from Spain, Portugal, England, France, Germany, and Italy enthusiastically joined the Knights of St. John. They weren't even all Catholics, there were Protestants amongst them too. Even today, there's a Protestant order of the Knights of Malta, as well as a Catholic order. The Knights became recognized as the very front line of the battle for Christendom. They were the bulwark to keep Europe safe from Islamic jihadists. The Knights of St. John were recognized as the toughest soldiers in Christendom. They would have been the Green Berets, the Special Forces, the SAS of their day. In 1522, 7,000 knights and soldiers on the island of Rhodes resisted 90,000 of the Sultan's forces for 6 months. Only when all their supplies were exhausted and no possibility of continuing the fight remained, only when they'd run out of food, water, ammunition, did the Knights of St. John board their ships and withdraw in good order. And so that brings us to 1565 and the Great Siege of Malta. Now, we speak of the Great Siege of Malta because this is the greatest and the biggest siege probably in all of history, but there was a siege of Malta in the Second World War. The British island of Malta was a major thorn in the side of the Italians and the German Afrika Korps in North Africa. In fact, the island of Malta was such a crippling blow to Erwin Rommel's forces that the bombers and the Spitfires and the submarines based on Malta made sure that most of the arms, supplies, resupplies, fuel, food, everything else going for the Afrika Korps got sunk in the Mediterranean. And so it's attributed that if the Italians had managed to seize Malta, then the Afrika Korps would have won the war in North Africa, taken Egypt, taken the Suez Canal, and probably kept going. It was only Malta that caused the defeat of the Afrika Korps by strangling them of their supplies, because most of the supplies, the fuel, everything that was coming to the Afrika Korps got sunk in the Mediterranean, and Malta was the base for those operations. So they came under a lot of attacks during the Second World War, and it's extraordinary what they survived, and how many of the convoys that were trying to resupply Malta got sunk in order as well. And there's a lot of sacrifice by the Royal Navy to be able to resupply Malta. It was a tough battle. And they lost a lot during the Second World War. But that's another siege. So here we're talking about the Great Siege of Malta. As the sun rose on the 18th of May, 1565, the horizon filled with white sails emblazoned with the Sultan's red crescent. The Great Siege of Malta began. And the invaders were supremely confident that they'd be able to overwhelm and subjugate the small island, this very few numbers of knights on the island of Malta. So, the three main forts are the centerpiece of the war. Fort St. Elmo at the top of Mount Skidabus, Fort St. Angelo on Singale, and Fort St. Michael on Burghley. And so, these are the three main forts where the battle will be centered. And the Great Siege developed along these lines. This is a pretty good picture of it. By the way, this bay here to the side of Mount Skidabus, this is the Bay of St. Paul, where St. Paul's ship got wrecked and where he was washed ashore. And that's why Malta is the first part of Europe to come to Christ, because of the work of St. Paul. They've got the highest church attendance in Europe too. They've got an island called Dragon's Point, named after the Muslim leader who led the attack. And obviously it wouldn't have been called that at the time that they arrived. But this is how the map of the battle goes. The first target was the fort of St. Ermelo, which dominated the entrance to the Grand Harbour. There was only 100 knights and 500 soldiers holding Fort St. Elmo, and Della Vete ordered them to fight to the last man. The length of their survival would determine the outcome of the whole campaign. So they were not coming back. They knew it was like a suicide mission. So one way, you hold that as long as you can, bleed the enemy, because the longer you can hold that, the more they've got to delay the attack on the other two forts. They can keep strengthening Fort St. Angelo, Fort St. Michael. The Turks had estimated they'd need 3 days to bombard St. Elmo into submission. But the garrison of St. Elmo held on through an incredible 35 days of constant bombardment, waves of assault. You've heard of St. Elmo's fire. That's what they're talking about. All of Europe was praying fervently. They realized what was at stake. Even the Protestant Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth, declared, if the Turks should prevail against the island of Malta, it's uncertain what further peril might follow to the rest of Christendom. This was no longer a Catholic Protestant thing. This was Christians versus the Turks. Christianity was at stake. This isn't, the denominational differences were no longer the concern. Protestants and Catholics stood together in Malta as well. Mustafa Pasha ordered 2 huge siege guns to be dragged up to Mount Skidabus. 2 60-pound Calvinians, that's almost 30 kilograms. That's not the weight of the cannon, that's the weight of the cannonball. 10 80-pounders, enormous basilics, firing a solid 160-pound shot, brought for the attack on St. Elmo. Now, in the Second World War, my father operated a 25-pounder. A 25-pounder was considered like the ultimate tank killer. And so a 25-pounder is very effective. And you've seen at the castle and downtown Cape Town, 12-pounder and 18-pounders. Those are the main ones being used to defend the castle. 60-pounders, 160-pounders, I mean, this is just colossal. These are designed to blow holes through the walls of castles, sinkhole ships. After a week of preparation and bombardment, a week of bombardment by such heavy artillery, the sandstone and lime blocks composing the fort of St. Elmo began to crumble. They must have been very well built to have withstood that long. And the Turks relentlessly pounded away at the small fort. After the first night of bombardment, the besieged knights made a sortie, stealthily lowering their drawbridge and capturing the closest enemy trench. And Mustafa commanded Janissaries forward. And the Janissaries stormed the trenches, but they were cut down by the cannon of St. Elmo. The arrival of Drajut, known amongst his men as the drawn sword of Islam and a scourge of the Christians, encouraged the Turkish forces. Drajut was famed as he is the ultimate Turkish warrior. He brought another 1,500 of his elite warriors. And Drajut noticed what Mustafa had missed. St. Ermelo was being resupplied every night from across the bay from St. Angelo. Boatloads of men were rowing across and they were resupplying and reinforcing St. Elmo every night. As the artillery bombardment of St. Elmo doubled in intensity, the defenders tried to erect counter walls behind the crumbling outer walls. So as bits and pieces of the wall fell, they were making a second wall behind it. If they overcome the first wall, they meet a second obstacle. At this time, word reached Della Valletta that the relief hoped for from nearby Sicily had been seriously delayed. This is the sort of thing that often happens. The hope you are promised is delayed. I mean, that's standard. Valletta read the dispatch to his council and declared, "We now know that we cannot look to ourselves for deliverance. It is only upon God and our own swords that we must rely." Yet this is no reason to be disheartened, rather the opposite. For it is better to know the truth of one's situation than be deceived by false hopes. Our faith and the honor of our order are in our own hands. We shall not fail. On the 3rd of June, a new battery erected on Tigny Point opened up a steady fire on St. Elmo, and the Janissaries attacked. They're the ones in blue. They swarmed over the reduced Ravelin. The Ravelin is the outer perimeter. And they wiped out the exhausted survivors. Then they stormed towards the gates of St. Elmo. But as they stormed the gates, the cannon protecting the portcullis opened fire on the advancing ranks of Janissaries. And the defenders of St. Elmo used burning hoops to set ablaze the white-robed Turks. They threw these hoops off there, and it would encompass them, and they couldn't easily escape. They've got these long flowing jalabas or robes, and so obviously pretty flammable. And they also used as arquebuses, which is like the wide funneled shotguns, and blocks of stone were thrown down, and the Muslims faced burning pitch, and cauldrons of boiling pitch set them ablaze. As they try to climb the walls, you just sort of move these up to the end, like these big pots that cannibals could cook a whole missionary family in, that sort of pot, and pour that down upon the invading Turks. Gravity does the rest. From dawn until noon, the battle raged around the bridge and around the walls of St. Elmo. But the flag of the Knights of St. John still waved above the ramparts, which were engulfed in flames and smoke, which is where the terms the fires of St. Elmo come from, because they saw the fires day and night. St. Elmo was burning. Wave after wave of Janissaries were unleashed upon St. Elmo. And by the time Mustafa called his troops off, over 2,000 of his Janissaries, his elite troops, lay dead, as opposed to 10 knights and 70 soldiers of Malta who died defending St. Elmo that day. A report from St. Elmo sent that night declared, pounded by hostile cannon, in arms always, and prepared for combat, by day exposed to the burning sun, by night to the cold and the damp. Privation of all kinds, from the blast of gunpowder, smoke, dust, wildfire, iron and stone, musketry, explosions of enormous batteries, insufficient nutrient. We are so disfigured we hardly recognize each other anymore. Ashamed of retiring for wounds not manifestly quite dangerous or almost mortal, those of us with the smaller bones dislocated or shattered and livid faces bruised with frightful scores, or extremely lame and whimpering woefully, these miserably battered and bandaged around the head, arms and slings, strange contortions, such figures were frequent and almost general. So, I've only got a few bones broken. It's not serious enough to report to the medic for, that sort of thing. We're going to stay at our post. The Turkish gunfire was so heavy, they seemed determined to reduce the fortress to powder. On Thursday, another Turkish attack was blasted by a hail of bullets and incendiary weapons, like these burning hoops. Yet the defenders came under such sustained fire, they could not even show themselves above the battlements. Just continuous stream of metal pouring at them. When the commander suggested that the fortress be evacuated and burned to the ground, Valletta reminded them, we swore obedience when we joined the order. We swore also on the vows of chivalry. Our lives would be sacrificed for the faith, whenever and wherever the call might come. Our brethren in St. Elmo must now accept that sacrifice. You can't just throw your lives away, and you can't just destroy and withdraw. You've got to stand there, you've got to fight as long as possible. The knight sent a further message urging, do not send any further reinforcements, since there will be no more than dead men. There's no chance of survival at St. Elmo. And they requested permission to storm the enemy and die honorably in battle, rather than remaining pounded behind the walls. And Valletta refused this. He said, the laws of honor cannot necessarily be satisfied by throwing away one's life when it seems convenient. A soldier's duty is to obey. You will tell your comrades they are to stay at their post, they are to remain there, and they are not to sally forth. They can delay the Turks longer by staying behind the battlements and fighting, and every day they delay them, the better for the whole cause. And of course, they're still hoping for some reinforcements to be sent from Europe. La Valletta sent another 15 knights, almost 100 soldiers, to strengthen the garrison at St. Elmo. I mean, these are volunteers, and I know there's no chance of holding St. Elmo, but they're going there just to drag it out longer and kill some more Turks before they can put their full weight upon the rest of the garrison. The Ottomans stormed the port repeatedly, and they were repulsed time and again. The first great night attack of the siege took place on the 10th of June. When dawn broke, over 1,500 of the Sultan's troops lay dead or dying in no man's land, between the Ravelin and the fort, the Ravelin being the outer perimeter. St. Elmo's losses that night totaled 60 to 1,500. The Turkish commander-in-chief now offered the Christians they might retire unmolested. You can withdraw with your weapons, your arms, your flags, and we'll give you no resistance. But each one resolved, we're going to die where we stand, we'll give no quarter, we're not going to retreat. No surrender, no retreat. On the night of the 15th of June, the whole Turkish fleet ringed the fort. 4,000 guns opened up on St. Elmo. Then the Layerlers, the fanatical corps of jihadists on drugs, launched a frenzied attack. But being on drugs doesn't make you a more effective soldier. But it does make you a more effective target. They were followed by a herd of dervishes. Now, you know the dervishes come from Sudan. You heard of the whirling dervishes. The Mahdi used the dervishes. So these are Sudanese Muslim fanatics. And then the Janissaries. And each attack was decimated, sent fleeing by the ferocious defense of the Knights of St. Elmo. Another 1,000 of the Turks died that day, and 150 of the garrison of St. Elmo perished. On the 18th of June, Valletta called for more volunteers to reinforce St. Elmo. I mean, that's incredible. 30 knights volunteered, another 300 soldiers. They came forward, they rowed across the harbour to the beleaguered, bombarded garrison of St. Elmo. The same day, Drajut was mortally wounded by a cannon shot. As the drawn sword of Islam was carried back to his tent, morale amongst the invading Turks was seriously weakened. I mean, this was the elite, this is the best. He is sort of the equivalent of, in our army, of Colonel Jan Breitenbach. This is the best they had. As St. Elmo was pummeled by concentrated bombardment, it seemed incredible that anything could exist in that smoking ruin. And as the Janissaries breached the walls, Chevalier de Montserrat directed cannon fire against the centre of the Janissary attack and saved the day. That day, St. Elmo lost 200 men and the Turks lost 2,000. On the dawn of the 23rd of June, the Ottoman galleys surrounded the ruined fort, unleashed more death and destruction upon the valiant defenders. Less than 300 remained in St. Elmo's fort. They sang hymns. They prayed. They divinely tolled their chapel bell. They prepared to meet the Lord. They could no longer, many of them couldn't stand. Many were just seated in chairs, fully armed, but incredibly they held out for another hour. As Mustafa Pasha carried the banner of the Sultan to replace the flag of St. John on St. Elmo, he gazed at the massive fort, St. Angelo across the bay, and he cried, Allah, if so small a son has cost us so dear, what price will we have to pay for so large a father? 35 days of ferocious courage of the defenders of St. Elmo had cost the invaders precious time and over 9,000 of their best troops. So Mustafa Pasha vindictively ordered the bodies of the knights to be decapitated, and the heads were placed on stakes and their corpses were nailed to crosses floated across the harbour. As the headless bodies of crucified knights washed up at the base of the Fort St. Angelo, La Valletta ordered the Turkish prisoners to be executed and the heads to be used as cannonballs to bombard the Turks. I mean, this is not just savage warfare, this is psychological warfare. And the message is clear. No surrender, no retreat. We're not asking for quarter, we're not giving any. The knights would fight to the very death. They wouldn't give any quarter and they wouldn't receive any quarter. So there was no reason for anyone to consider defecting, surrendering, because there was no mercy that's going to be offered on either side. The morale of the defenders of Malta was lifted when 4 galleys from Sicily managed to evade the Turkish blockade and landed a small relief force of 42 knights and 700 militia. Not much, but every bit helps. And siege guns were transported to the heights of Caradino to begin the bombardments of Fort St. Angelo and St. Michael and the villages of Burgu and Sengali. And 70 cannon from Mount Skirabas, Gallows Point, Tigny Point, Mount Salvatore, and from the heights of Caradino opened up a heavy crossfire on St. Angelo and St. Michael and on the villages of Burgu and Sengali. On the morning of the 15th of July, Mustafa ordered the first major assault on both land and sea. The Algerian troops stormed the walls of St. Michael from the landward side. The Turks landed troops to storm the seaward walls. The Algerians came on with a wild screaming rush. The Christians counterattacked and turned the tide of battle. As the Muslim invaders fled, Mustafa sent in his masterstroke. 1,000 of his elite Janissaries aboard 10 large boats to land at the northern wall while the Christian defenders were preoccupied defending the southern wall. It should have worked. What Mustafa did not know was Valletta had positioned a battery of artillery at the base of St. Angelo to counter just such an eventuality. And Chevalier de Gural, who commanded the 5-gun battery, could scarcely believe his eyes as he saw these Janissaries sailing straight towards the muzzles of his guns. At the ideal target range, he ordered his men to open fire, and 9 of the 10 boats were sunk and 800 Janissaries disappeared into the water. Only the 10th boat managed to survive. It fled back across the harbour. And the few Janissaries who managed to make it to land received St. Elmo's pay, which meant no mercy. As you treated our men, you're going to be treated. The knights opened their gates and charged the Muslims, sending them fleeing. Now, following this humiliation on the 15th of July, Mustafa adopted a more cautious approach, depending upon his artillery to reduce the walls, to undermine the morale of the defenders by incessant bombardment. From north and south, from east and west, the Christian fortresses came under withering and sustained artillery barrages. This can only make one think of the First World War, when soldiers in the trenches suffered what they called, well, not battle fatigue. In the First World War, they called it shell shock. And shell shock, when you're artillery barraged for too long, everything in your body just revolts. It's just, you can't help shaking. It's just a physical thing. It's not just psychological. So people suffering shell shock from the First World War artillery, I would imagine the people here in Malta must have suffered something like that, because you can't sustain continuous artillery barrage without really disorientating you. I've had a few artillery and rocket bombardments and air bombings, and you are so disorientated. Your ears are numb. You can't think straight. I mean, your whole body is in a fog, and you can hardly walk straight. It's very disorientating. Even during training, when they throw flashbangs, which are these stun grenades, they're not meant to kill, they're just meant to disorientate. But these, for training, when you've got stun grenades exploding near you, it's very hard to maintain anything. Only in the movies can a person get up after getting bombed and do all these phenomenal maneuvers. Only in Mission Impossible can he outrun an explosion. For the rest of us, it's extremely disorientating when you've got artillery exploding around. You can't hear, you can't think straight, you can't even see straight. And as for walking, you can't walk straight either. It's very disorientating. And for the people to have withstood such bombardment and still fought at the end of it, absolutely extraordinary. So the Turks gave the besieged no respite. The bombardment continued all day, all night, throughout the last week of July. And at dawn on the 2nd of August, the Turks advanced with all their cannon thundering at once. The people in Sicily, over 100 kilometers away, could hear the cannon fire. That reminds one that during the Battle of the Somme, people in villages in England could hear the artillery. It was that much artillery being fired at the same time. My father said at the Battle of El Alamein, you could read a newspaper at night from the artillery flashes. There was so much artillery going off, they could literally sit there and read the newspaper. Which, I mean, just imagine. The heaviest bombardments of the siege. It seemed impossible that any man could live through the sustained fire, let alone be in any shape to fight in the crumbling ruins of the forts the next day. But from every side, from every ridge and slope, Muslims swarmed forward like a tidal wave against the garrisons. Yet attack after attack was repulsed, and Mustafa once again was forced to concede defeat. As his exhausted, decimated assault troops withdraw, Mustafa decided to subject the Christians to a further 5 days of continuous bombardment before attempting the next attack. In all, it's calculated over 130,000 cannonballs were fired from the Turkish guns against the Christian defenders of Malta. You can find a lot of these cannonballs in Malta. They've got them all over the place. If you need a paperweight, a door stopper, they're all there. Throughout the siege, men, women, and children of all ages worked alongside the soldiers to rebuild the walls. As soon as the walls are getting crumbling, they helped them to rebuild, repairing the defenses. And the women and children were preparing the bombs and the ammunition. It reminds one that during the Great Trek, the Boer women and children were often reloading the muskets while the men were defending the lager. On the 7th of August, the Islamic assault was renewed. Like a tsunami, the enemy rushed upon Birgu and Sengali simultaneously. Yet as they swept over the ditch, half filled with rubble from the walls, and through the breaches of the walls blasted by continuous cannon fire, they were confronted by another interior wall, something they hadn't expected. We've blown holes in these walls, but while they've been blowing holes in those walls, the defenders are building a second interior wall. And the troops who poured through the outer breaches now came under withering fire from the garrison. Unable to turn back because the weight of their numbers pressing behind them, they were trapped in a narrow killing ground where they were slaughtered in their hundreds. Now, the walls of Malta today are much, much, much higher and thicker than they were at that time. But this is where it roughly happened. But obviously later they built phenomenal walls. They weren't this high at the time. Then the Christian defenders leapt from their entrenchments and stormed the faltering attackers. The Muslims turned and fled, slipping and sliding over the blood of their comrades and tripping over the mounds of dead bodies as they fled from the fight. Yet, while the Turkish attack on St. Elmo was routed, the assault on St. Michael was succeeding, and Turkish flags began to appear on the ramparts. It was at this critical point that the governor of Medina, the capital of Malta in the hinterland, launched his cavalry force against the lightly guarded Turkish headquarters and stores. The Christians overwhelmed the sentries, killing every Turk that they could find, capturing or destroying a huge store of provisions and ammunition. And as a messenger galloped up to Mustafa to inform him a large Christian force had swarmed over their camp, Mustafa feared the worst. He assumed this must be the relief force from Sicily that had been delayed so long. So Mustafa ordered a general retreat. So in this way, Fort St. Michael was saved. However, there was no relief force. And Valletta called his council together that night and informed his men, "I will now tell you openly, my brethren, there is no hope to be looked for except in the succor of Almighty God, the only true help. He who has looked after us until now will not forsake us, nor will he deliver us into the hands of the enemies of our holy faith. We are soldiers and we shall die fighting. If by any evil chance the enemy should prevail, we can expect no better treatment than our brethren who were in St. Elmo. Let no man think there can be any question of receiving honorable treatment or escaping with his life. If we are beaten, we shall all be killed. It would be better to die in battle than terribly and ignominiously at the hands of the Muslims." And that's true because, for example, at Crete, where they were talked into surrendering, the Christians had found themselves, they were flogged and enslaved, and the commander, who had received guarantee of honorable treatment, had all his teeth broken and he was flogged daily in the village square. And, just this kind of treatment, there's no motivation or temptation to surrender when the enemy is not going to treat you decently anyway. There was to be no more talk of relief forces, he said, with the greatest devotion, with the firmest hope and faith that they would be received into glory, they resolved to die for the cause. The Muslims began to tunnel under the defenses to plant mines. And with a tremendous explosion, the bastion of Castile in Sengele collapsed. As the survivors staggered back in confusion, waves of Turks stormed through the breach. Valletta seized a pike, boldly ran from his command post towards the breach. Seeing the Grand Master, a man in his 70s, running to the point of danger, all the knights and soldiers joined him in turning back the tide of the Islamic advance. And as a grenade exploded near Valletta, knights rushed to defend him. "Withdraw, sire, to a place of safety," but Valletta refused. "The enemy is already in retreat," they said. Valletta continued to advance against the enemy, saying, "As long as their banners still wave in the wind, I will not withdraw." And as long as he was fighting, the others had to too. So the knights and soldiers surged forward with incredible tenacity, until within a few minutes the Turks were routed and they were fleeing in disarray. There was no darkness that night, as the gunfire lit up the sky and the cannon pounded the walls. Yet the Christians stood firm, and by dawn the Turks withdrew in defeat. Now Mustafa unleashed his siege tower. The siege tower was higher than the walls, and the Janissaries used the platform to fire upon the defenders of Burgu. Valletta had his workmen burrow a hole in the base of the wall facing the tower, and they wheeled out a large cannon which fired 2 large cannonballs fastened together with a chain. So this sort of would swivel around, and it sliced through the structure, causing it to collapse, spilling the Turks and the incendiary grenades and the fuel which set the giant tower ablaze. On the 20th of August, the Turks brought up another larger siege engine, reinforced at the base with earth and stonework, so they couldn't do that one again. So the Knights of St. John then stormed the tower in a surprise sortie, swept up the laddered floors, eliminating the attacking Turks in a matter of minutes. They then turned the siege engine into an additional fighting platform to defend their walls. The 2 Turkish cannon on it were used to pour fire into the dismayed Muslim jihadists. At this point, Mustafa learned that a large supply ship from North Africa to replenish their dwindling supplies of ammunition and food had been captured by a Christian galley. So despondency swept the Turkish camp. They were now running so short of gunpowder they had to suspend the bombardment. Thousands of Turks were now laid low with sickness. Even water and food was in short supply for the attackers. Remember, there's no natural water source on the island. There's no rivers on Malta. They had to ship in their water from the mainland. So the besiegers were now in deep trouble. And so much of their stores had been destroyed by the sortie by the garrison at Medina. So Mustafa now determined to capture the capital, Medina, in the hinterland and use it as his winter quarters. Winter can be quite miserable if you're not in a decent kind of abode. So anticipating the Turkish intentions, the governor of Medina dressed the civilians in soldiers' uniforms, had them patrol the ramparts along with the garrison. All available cannon were brought to the side from which the Turkish assault would approach. They even had women up there dressed in armor and being able to give the Turks impression that they had far more soldiers at this fortress than they actually had. And as the Muslims toiled up the long slopes to the city, they were shocked to see the walls bristling with cannon and armed and uniformed defenders. As they came within range, the cannon opened fire. Now, to open fire immediately suggests you've got so much ammunition to spare, you're even willing to fire when they're just barely in range. And so the dismayed Turks halted and turned back. It's another impregnable position. It's another St. Elmo. And the Turks launched another attack on St. Angelo and St. Michael on the 1st of September. But the men now were so drained, so disheartened, so reduced in numbers, and enfeebled by fever and dysentery, the attack failed even before it had begun. It is not the will of Allah that we should become masters of Malta, was the general consensus. Fatalism is one of the deadly weaknesses of Islam. On the 5th of September, Viceroy Don Garcia set sail from Sicily with a relief force made up of professional soldiers from all over Europe, including Italians, Germans, French, other European volunteers. This was a European concern. The relief force consisted of 10,000 fighting men in 28 ships. When news of the relief arrived on the 8th of September, Mustafa's army was on the verge of mutiny. The Turkish fleet had lost the will to fight. They did not even attempt to contest the landing. Of course, when you're dealing with reliefs coming by ship, the best thing is stop them before they get to shore. They didn't even try. As the invaders began to embark, Mustafa learned the relief force is actually smaller than his army. So he ordered his men back on shore. The relief force charged the Muslims, and in a fierce battle, they slaughtered 3,000 more of Mustafa's army, driving the remainder into the sea. Valletta rushed cannon up to St. Elmo, fired upon the retreating fleet, and the day the Muslims fled Malta was the 11th of September, 1565. The bells of all the churches rang out. Over the shattered houses of Burgu, the victors sang Te Deum, to the glory of God, who grants the victories. Nearly 250 knights of the Order of St. John had lost their lives in the Great Siege. The survivors were all wounded. Many were crippled for life. Of the original 9,000 garrison, barely 600 were still capable of fighting. But the Turks had lost over 30,000 men out of their original 48,000. The Sultan Suleiman was devastated when he heard of this defeat. Next year, I myself, the Sultan Suleiman, will lead an expedition against this accursed island. I will not spare one single inhabitant, he warned. But the following year, before he could carry out this threat, Suleiman died, aged 72. At the beginning of his reign, he had been defeated before the gates of Vienna in 1529. Now, at the end of his reign, his army had survived and suffered the most humiliating decisive defeat on Malta. The Ottoman Turks never again attempted to besiege Malta. The failure of the siege denied the Turkish forces control of Western Mediterranean and prevented their plans to conquer southern Europe. The Great Siege of Malta was one of the most decisive victories in military history, certainly one of the greatest sieges in history. It changed the course of history. It prevented the Western expansion of the Turkish power. All Europe rejoiced in celebrating this victory, and in Malta, the church bells rang out triumphantly. Honors were showered upon the Grand Master of Valletta. Every kingdom in Europe gave him honors. And at last, the Knights of St. John actually received the generous financial contributions they needed not only to survive, but to rebuild the ruined cities and the fortresses of Malta. The Italian engineer Francesco Zapparelli helped plan a magnificent citadel to be called Velete, named after the hero of the siege. Velete is built on Mount Skirabus, including the site of the Fort San Angelo, which of course did not exist anymore. So here is where St. Michael and St. Angelo was, and now the whole Mount Skirabus is the citadel of Velete, where the St. Elmo's fort was before. The Cathedral of St. John in Velete is described by Sir Walter Scott as the most magnificent church in all of Europe. Absolutely extraordinary. They spared no expenses. They put everything into this. So that's the Church of St. John. And when he died, Velete was buried in a great crypt in the Cathedral of St. John, where the inscription reads, "Here lies Velete, scourge of Africa and Asia, the shield of Europe, and whence he expelled the barbarians by his holy arms." And his crypt with the lion and the eagle. The heroic defense of Malta against such overwhelming odds for over 4 months of relentless bombardment and assault inspired all of Europe to renew their efforts to defeat the Turkish menace. And there's just one of the artworks on the walls of the church in the city. This is a beginning of a major series of victories against Islam. In 1571, the Turkish fleet was decisively annihilated at the Battle of Lepanto, the biggest naval battle of galleys, rowing ships in history. And the last great Turkish threat to the heart of Europe was defeated at the gates of Vienna on 11th of September 1683, when the Polish cavalry, led by an aging Polish king, King Sobieski, he was in his 70s. To ride a horse in his 70s is impressive. To lead a cavalry charge against the biggest force ever seen in Europe, and to succeed, phenomenal. And so the Poles saved the day on that occasion. And by the way, some good things came out of that too. The Christians from Vienna found lots of coffee in the tents of the Turks, and a very enterprising Capuchin monk opened up a coffee shop, which is where the term cappuccino comes from. You know, a Capuchin monk and coffee. The bakers made a crescent-shaped pastry, which when the Austrian Princess Mary Antoinette went to Paris, they called it the croissant. And so the croissant is also a celebration of the defeat of the Muslim Turks at the gates of Vienna. So if you have coffee, cappuccinos, or croissants, just remember what it's there for. I bet the average person in these shops doesn't know that. But Velete stands as a phenomenal bastion. The Muslim Turks never attempted to take Malta again. And you know, this place is built to withstand sieges. Malta was one of the first nations in Europe to embrace Christianity because the Apostle Paul was shipwrecked on that island. Remember, he was bitten by a snake and survived, and the people came to believe. Malta has the highest church attendance of any country in Europe. And for some strange reason, they don't allow Muslim migrants to come into Malta. Its area is a mere 316 kilometers squared, consisting of 3 small islands with dry limestone hills, no rivers. Total population is just over 400,000. They received their independence from Britain in 1964. They've been a parliamentary republic since 1974. They entered the European Union in 2004, and Malta celebrates the 8th of September as a national holiday to mark the lifting of the Great Siege. Although 11th of September marks when the Muslims finally fled, but the relief arrived on the 8th of September. Psalm 46 inspired, "A mighty fortress is our God. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, even though the earth be removed, even though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, though its waters roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with its swelling. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place of the tabernacle of the Most High. God is in the midst of her, she shall not be moved. God shall help her just at the break of dawn. The nations raged, the kingdoms were moved. He uttered his voice, the earth melted. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge." And by the way, for those who don't know Old King James English, The Lord of hosts means the God of armies. So this will be uploaded on frontlinemissionsa.org website for you to share with others on the Frontline YouTube page. And we've got other great soldiers for Christ that we can share in future Reformation Society meetings. But there's some wonderful books on the Siege of Malta, the Great Siege, Knights versus Turks, Clash of Cultures, the Great Siege of Malta, the Last Battle of the Crusades. And I've seen one book that's called Blood Rock, which is also pretty good. We need to know how to evangelize Muslims because they're attacking us, they're invading our countries. Well, the best we can do is counterattack by sharing the gospel with them and evangelizing the Muslims in our neighborhoods.